Hi, how are you? For the past 4,000 pages, I have been reading Tolstoy. Whenever I start to read books from a new writer, I look up some information about the writers themselves, just to know what did they know from their own experiences and what have been true fiction. Tolstoy was a Russian writer. He was born in 1828 and died in the old age of 82 in 1910. He was born in a poor aristocratic family, which is a little bit odd saying, because they weren't actually poor, not as I understand being poor means. They didn't have to work for their ends meet in their lives, but nevertheless they might have been poorer than their ancestors before in previous centuries. So poor, yes, but poor, no. Tolstoy and his siblings were left orphan before Tolstoy was 10, and he was brought up by a distant cousin. But instead of that, despite of that, they got a traditional upbringing of upper-class children. For example, they spoke fluently French, like all aristocrat children did then. French was the common language of the European courts, so if you wanted to climb up a social ladder or just stay in the ladder that you are in, you had to speak French. Otherwise, you would be considered as not so civilized. But Tolstoy was interested in languages, and he studied them in university. He had a goal of being a diplomat, but not the patience to match, I imagine. He was very good at learning languages, that's for sure, because he had an active correspondence in different entities and different persons in the future about his ideals of peace and about rooting out poverty. But he didn't study languages very long, but he switched to the law. That would have been beneficial education also, but he didn't continue that very long either. He thought that the laws that were taught then in Russia didn't serve so well the common man, and they weren't exactly aligned with his moral views. Tolstoy was a religious man, Orthodox Christian, and he was that even in young age, but much more in the older age. But when he left university, he was a young man. He moved to St. Petersburg and lived a life of a young, wealthy, single man. So there were parties and gambling and parties and gambling, I can only assume. But because of gambling, Tolstoy fell into debt and decided to join the army to pay his debts. I understand that gambling was a quite serious problem in Russia those days, because it's described in quite many books. People that lost their fortune overnight, or something worse. Well, Tolstoy stopped gambling and went to army. He spent there the next 4.5 years. He took part, for example, to Sevastopol siege, which is in the same area as Ukraine is now. So Ukraine is not first time as a battlefield, but there has been many times before. Tolstoy was shocked about the war, how brutal it was, and how people died. And they didn't die by bullets and swords only. But because of famine, because of a cold, because of diseases, because lack of equipment, and even if the Tsar had sent them to war, he didn't provide them with the proper nourishment or proper gear, and that shook him. And how people died, from his point of view, in vain. He started to think that lives are not appreciated enough, that murder is a murder, even in the battlefield, that it's not right to kill people just because it's war. They are still people. And this, of course, comes down to his religious views and is written in many of his books that he wrote later. After army, he decided to travel around Europe, see new places and see new people. And he did. During his time in Paris, he saw a public execution, which again shook him a great deal. He understood that not only wars kill people, but governments do executions. And he didn't see that it was appropriate. He also thought that the sophistication in Europe was too shallow. And due to those reasons and a few others, he returned back to Russia. He decided to get married and got married with the 17-year-old Sofia. They returned to his family estate Yasnaya Polyana, where he lived the rest of his life. And in there he really began to write his big books, his great stories. His wife acted as his secretary and was also, of course, mother to their 13 children, from which 7 lived to be adults. The first book that he wrote was War and Peace, which describes the time that Napoleon tried to invade Russia. It's a magnificent book. After that, he wrote Anna Karenina, which is another hefty volume, and his last big piece was a Resurrection, which is the hardest of these books, I think, after now reading all three. But it was worth reading anyway. In addition to these, there is this book called Confessions. It's also been translated as Consciences, which is, I think, a better translation. It describes the book better. Confessions is not a fiction. It's a collection of letters and newspaper articles that Tolstoy wrote and was published. In that book, Tolstoy, or in that collection, it's the most obvious how Tolstoy thought about things. He was pacifist. He was against war in all of its forms and all of its reasons. And he was one of the first in continental Europe, one of the first very visible pacifists. He thought that ordinary men don't care who's in power. They only care who they have to pay taxes to. And therefore, wars don't benefit them. They only suffer when there is a war. They have to work even harder, and they have to give up their sons for army, to be soldiers. Tolstoy understood that well. He himself had a peasant in his farm or in his estate, and he socialized with them. He wanted to know what they thought, and he spent time with them. But the main idea that's in that book, The Confessions, is that people will take over. That someday ordinary people will get sick of kings and queens and tsars and wars, and there will be a revolution. Ordinary people will take over, kings and queens and tsars will fall, and after that there will be peace. There will be permanent peace in the world, which was quite a revolutionary idea. He thought even that patriotism was only invention of Tsar to get people to fight one another, to think that the other people across the border are different than us, that we are good and they are bad, and therefore we have to fight. We have to fight them. But Tolstoy didn't think that. He thought that all people are alike, and all people want peace, that nobody benefits from the war except the kings and queens and tsars that have more money and more power. Those kind of thoughts were quite revolutionary. It was sheer miracle that Tolstoy wasn't incarcerated or executed in Russia or sent to Siberia, which would have been the same thing for an old man. But he held his head. He became even more religious fanatic, with his thoughts about Sermon of Mount and about 10 Commandments, and how they should be lived and obeyed to the dot. There is no ifs and buts and excuses and special circumstances, no. Murder is a murder everywhere. There is no exceptions. And that was his way of thinking. And even though he was very religious and took his readings very seriously, Russian Orthodox Church was also a little bit in trouble with his views. They tried to ban him a few times, I think, but didn't quite succeed in the end. Tolstoy was a very known man, a known writer, and they didn't want to mess things up, because of course there were many followers, many people that look up to Tolstoy and his thinking. In the old age, in the very end, he started to think about poverty even more. He wanted to give his land up, to give his estate to the peasants. But of course his wife didn't let him do that. No, if you want to give your fortune away, give it to your children and not to ordinary men. They do not know what to do about it. But that's some kind of ideology that is also described in his books. If you read between the lines, or you don't have to read between the lines in all the cases, the text is very plain. But if you want to read one book, just one, from Tolstoy, read Confessions. The first episode is a story about Russian and French soldiers meeting from various towns and having fun, and I didn't get the drift of it, so you can skip it if you want to. But the rest of the articles are very good. So that was short take on Tolstoy. It may not be the best writer, but he's good. And we have to start somewhere, don't we? But I think that I will make a dedicated video about the other books, about War and Peace and Anna Karenina, and maybe even Resurrection. I hope you have a great day. See you soon. Goodbye.